Behind them walked the only, chapter 5, behind them walked the only living thing that shared their pilgrimage, the dog. And by degrees they reached the briny sea. Then, with souls well disciplined, they reached the northern region, and beheld, with heaven-aspiring hearts, the mighty mountain Himavat. Whereupon the lake was lapping, the lilacs were blowing, the chernars were building, the mountains were glistening. The waterfalls were playing, the spring was green, the snow was white, the sky was blue. The fruit blossoms were clouds, and he was still thirsty. Then the snow was not glistening, the fruit blossoms were not clouds, they were mosquitoes. The Himalayas were hidden by dust, and he was thirstier than ever. Then the lake was blowing, the snow was blowing, the waterfalls were blowing, the fruit blossoms were blowing, the seasons were blowing away. He was blowing away himself, whirled by a storm of blossoms into the mountains, where now the rain was falling. But this rain, that fell only on the mountains, did not assuage his thirst. Nor was he after all in the mountains. He was standing among cattle in a stream. He was resting, with some ponies knee-deep beside him in the cool marshes. He was lying face downward, drinking from a lake that reflected the white cap ranges, the cloud piled 5 miles high behind the mighty mountain Himavat, the purple chenars, and a village nestling among the mulberries. Yet his thirst still remained unquenched. Perhaps because he was drinking, not water, but lightness and promise of lightness. How could he be drinking promise of lightness? Perhaps because he was drinking not water, but certainty of brightness. How could he be drinking certainty of brightness? Certainty of brightness, promise of lightness, of light, 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 and again of light, 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 light. The consul, an inconceivable anguish of horripilating hangover thunderclapping about his skull, and accompanied by a protective screen of demons nattering in his ears, became aware that in the horrid events of his being observed by his neighbors, it could hardly be supposed he was just sauntering down his garden with some innocent horticultural object in view, nor even that he was sauntering. The consul, who had waked a moment or two ago on the porch and remembered everything immediately, was almost running. He was also lurching. In vain he tried to check himself, plunging his hands with extraordinary attempt at nonchalance, in which he hoped he might appear more than a hint of consular majesty, deeper into the sweat-soaked pockets of his dress trousers. And now, rheumatisms discarded, he really was running. Might he not, then, be reasonably suspected of a more dramatic purpose, of having assumed, for instance, the impotent buskin of a William Blackstone, leaving the Puritans to dwell among the Indians, or the desperate mien of his friend Wilson, who he so magnificently abandoned the university expedition to disappear. Likewise, in a pair of dress trousers into the jungles of darkest Oceania. Never to return. Not very reasonably. For one thing, if he continued much further in this present direction toward the bottom of his garden, any such visioned escape into the unknown must shortly be arrested by what was, for him, an unscalable wire fence. Do not be so foolish as to imagine you have no object, however. We warned you, we told you so, but now that in spite of all of our pleas you have gone yourself into this deplorable... He recognized the tone of one of his familiars, faint among the other voices as he crashed on through the metamorphoses of dying and reborn hallucinations, like a man who does not know that he has been shot from behind. Condition, the voice went on severely. You have to do something about it. Therefore we are leading you toward the accomplishment of this something. I'm not going to drink, the consul said, halting suddenly. Or am I? Not the mescal, anyway. Of course not. The bottle's just there, beyond that bush. Pick it up. I can't, he objected. That's right, just take one drink, just the necessary, the therapeutic drink. Perhaps 2 drinks. God, the consul said. Ah, good. God, Christ. Then of course you can say it doesn't count. It doesn't. It's mescal. Of course it... Not, it's tequila. You might have another. Thanks, I will. The consul palsied readily the bottle to his lips. Bliss, Jesus, sanctuary. Horror, he added. Stop. Put that bottle down, Geoffrey Firmin. What are you doing to yourself? Another voice said in his ear so loudly he turned round. On the path before him, a little snake he had thought a twig was rustling into the bushes, and he watched it a moment through his dark glasses, fascinated. It was a real snake, all right. Not that he was much bothered by anything so simple as snakes. He reflected with a degree of pride, gazing straight into the eyes of the dog. It was a pariah dog and disturbingly familiar. Pero, he repeated, as it still stood there. But had not this incident occurred? Was it not now, as it were, occurring an hour or two ago? He thought in a flash. Strange. He dropped the bottle, which was of white curated glass. Tequila Anejo de Jalisco, it said on the label. Out of sight in the undergrowth, looking about him. All seemed normal again. Anyway, both snake and dog had gone, and the voices had ceased. The consul now felt himself in a position to entertain, for a minute, the illusion that all was really normal. Yvonne would probably be asleep, no point in disturbing her yet. And it was fortunate he remembered about the almost full bottle of tequila. Now he had a chance to straighten up a little, which he never could have done on the porch before greeting her again. There was altogether too much difficulty involved, under the circumstances, in drinking on the porch. It was a good thing a man knew where to have a quiet drink where he wanted it, without being disturbed, etc., etc. All these thoughts were passing through his mind, which, so to say, nodded gravely, accepting them with the most complete seriousness, while he gazed back up to his garden. Oddly enough, it did not strike him as being nearly so ruined as it had earlier appeared. Such chaos might exist even lent an added charm. He liked the exuberance of the unclipped growth at hand. Whereas further away, the superb plantains flowering so finely and obscenely, the splendid trumpet vines, brave and stubborn pear trees, the papayas planted around swimming pool and beyond, the low white bungalow itself covered by bougainvillea, its long porch like a bridge of a ship, which inadvertently blended the moment, as he turned by accident into a strange subsequent view of the plains of volcanoes, with a huge indigo sun multitudinously blazing the southeast. Or was it north-northeast? North-northwest? He noted it all with sorrow, even with a certain ecstasy. Lighting a cigarette, and alas, though he repeated the word alas aloud mechanically, then, the alcohol sweat pouring off its brows like water, he began to walk down the path toward the fence, separating his garden from the little new public one that truncated his property. In this garden, which he hadn't looked at since the day Hugh arrived, wherein he'd hidden the bottle, in which he'd seemed carefully and lovingly kept, there existed at that moment certain evidence of works left uncompleted. Tools, unusual tools, a murderous machete, an oddly shaped fork, somehow nakedly impaling the mind, its twisting tines glittering in the sunlight, were leaning against the fence, and also with something else. A slate uprooted anew, a sign uprooted anew, whose long pallid face stared through the wire at him. ¿Le gusta este jardín? It asked. ¿Le gusta este jardín? ¿Que es suyo? Envida que sus hijos lo destruyan. The consul stared back at the black words on the sign without moving. You like this garden? Why is it yours? We evict those who destroy. It's actually not a good translation. Simple words, simple and terrible words. Words which, perhaps a final judgment on one, were nevertheless unproductive of any emotion whatsoever, unless a kind of colorless, cold, or white agony, an agony that chilled that is ice mescal drink in the Hotel Canada on the morning of Yvonne's departure. However, he was drinking tequila again now, and with no very clear idea how he'd returned so quickly and found the bottle. The subsequent bouquet of pitch and tornadoes. Careless of being observed this time, he drank longly and deeply, then stood, as he had been observed too by his neighbor Mr. Quincy, who was watering flowers in the shade of their common fence to the left of the briars. Stood facing his bungalow once more. He felt hemmed in. Gone was the little dishonest vision of order. Over his house, above the specters of neglect that now refused to disguise themselves, the tragic wings of untenable responsibilities hovered. Behind him, in the other garden, his fate repeated softly, "Why is it yours? And do you like this garden? We evict those who destroy." Perhaps the sign didn't mean quite that, for alcohol sometimes affected the consul's Spanish adversely, or perhaps the sign itself, inscribed by some Aztec, was wrong, but it was near enough. Coming to an abrupt decision, he dropped the tequila into the undergrowth again and turned to the public garden, walking with an attempted easy stride. Not that he had any intention of verifying the words on the sign, which certainly seemed to have more question marks than it should have. No, what he wanted, he now saw very clearly, was to talk to someone. That was necessary, but it was more merely than that. What he wanted involved something like the grasping, at this moment, of a brilliant opportunity. Or more accurately, of an opportunity to be brilliant. An opportunity evidenced by that apparition of Mr. Quincy through the briars which, now upon his right, he must circumvent in order to reach him. Yet this opportunity to be brilliant was, in turn, more like something else. An opportunity to be admired even. And he could at least thank the tequila for such honesty, however brief its duration, to be loved. Loved precisely for what was another question. Since he put it to himself, he might answer. love for my reckless and irresponsible appearance, or rather for that fact that beneath this appearance so obviously burns the fire of genius, which, not so obviously, is not my genius, but in an extraordinary manner that of my old and good friend, Abraham Taskerson, great poet, who once spoke so glowingly of my potentialities as a young man. And what he wanted then, then, he had turned right without looking at the sign and was following the path along the wire fence. Cool. He thought, casting one yearning look at the plains, and at this moment he could have sworn that a figure, the details of whose dress did not have some time to make out before it departed, but apparently in some kind of mourning, had been standing, head bowed in deepest anguish, near the center of the public garden. What you want then, Jean-Pierre Freeman, if only as an antidote against such routine hallucinations, is, why it is, nothing less than to drink indeed, all day, just as the clouds once more bid you, and yet, not quite. Again, it is more subtle than this. You do not wish merely to drink, but to drink in a particular place and in a particular town. Paris. It was a name suggestive of old marble and the gale-swept Cyclades. The Farolito in Paris, how it called him with its gloomy voices of the night and early dawn. But the consul, he had inclined right against leaving the wire fence behind. Realized he wasn't yet drunk enough to be very sanguine about his chances of going there. The day offered too many immediate pitfalls, was the exact word. He had almost fallen back in the barranca, an unguarded section of whose hither bank the ravine curved sharply down here towards the Alpacancingo road, curve again and follow its direction, bisecting the public garden, adding at this juncture a tiny fifth side to his estate. He paused, peeping, tequila unafraid, over the bank. Ah, the frightful cleft, the eternal horror of opposites, thou mighty gulf, insatiate comrade, deride me not, though I seemed petulant to fall into thy chops. One was, come to that, always stumbling upon the damned thing, this immense, intricate donga cutting right through the town, right, indeed, through the country, in places a 200-foot sheer drop into what pretended to be a churlish river during the rainy season, but which, even now, though one couldn't see the bottom, was probably beginning to resume its normal role of the general Tartarus of gigantic jakes. It was perhaps not so frightening here. One might even climb down if one wished, by easy stages, of course, and take the occasional swig of tequila along the way, to visit the cloacal Prometheus who doubtless inhabited it. The consul walked on more slowly. He had come face to face with his house again, and simultaneously to the path skirting Mr. Quincy's garden. On his left, beyond the common fence, now at hand, the green lawns of the American, at the moment being sprinkled by innumerable small whizzing hoses, swept down parallel with his own briars. Nor could any English turf have appeared smoother or lovelier. Suddenly overwhelmed by the sentiment, as at the same time by a violent attack of hiccups, the consul stepped behind a gnarled fruit tree rooted in his side, but spreaded its remnant of shade over the other, leaned against it, holding his breath. In this curious way he imagined himself hidden from Mr. Quincy, working further up, but he soon forgot all about Quincy in spasmodic admiration of his garden. Would it happen at the end, and would this save one, that old Popeye, would begin to seem less desirable than a slag heap in Chesterless Street, and that mighty Johnsonian prospect, the road to England, would stretch out again in the western ocean of his soul. Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Hickett, said the consul, taken aback by the premature rediscovery, at such close quarters, of the tall, slightly stooping figure, in khaki shirt and gray flannel trousers, sandaled, immaculate, gray-haired, complete, fit, a credit to Soda Springs, and carrying a watering can, who was regarding him distastefully through horn-rimmed spectacles from one side to the other fence. Ah, good morning, Quincy. What's good about it? The retired walnut grower asked suspiciously, continuing his work of watering his flower beds, which are out of range of the ceaselessly swinging hoses. The consul gestured towards his briars, and perhaps unconsciously also in the direction of the tequila bottle. I saw you from over there. I was just out inspecting my jungle. Don't you know? You're doing what? Mr. Quincy glanced at him over the top of the watering can as if to say, I have seen all this going on. I know all about it because I am God, and even when God was much older than you are, he was nevertheless up at this time and fighting it, if necessary, while you don't even know whether or not you're up yet. unsafe. And even if you have been out all night, you are certainly not fighting it, as I would be. Just as I would be ready to fight anything or anybody else too, for that matter, at the drop of a hat. A hat. And I'm afraid it really is a jungle too, pursued the consul. In fact, I expect Rousseau to come riding out of it at any moment on a tiger. What's that? Mr. Quincy said, frowning in a manner that might have meant, and God never drinks before breakfast either. On a tiger, the consul repeated. The other gazed at him a moment with cold, sardonic eyes of the material world. I expect so, he said sourly. Plenty tigers, plenty elephants too. Might I ask you if the next time you inspect your jungle you mind being sick on your own side of the fence? Picket, answered the consul simply. Picket, he snarled, laughing, and trying to take himself by surprise, he whacked himself hard in the kidneys, a remedy which, strangely, seemed to work. Sorry I gave that impression. It was merely the damned hiccups. So I observed, Mr. Quincy said. Perhaps he too had cast a subtle glance toward the ambush of the tequila bottle. Funny thing is, interrupted the consul, I scarcely touch anything more than Tequan water all night. By the way, how did you manage to survive the ball? Mr. Quincy stared at him evenly, then began to refill his watering can from a hydrant nearby. Just Tehuacan, the consul confirmed, and a little gaseosa. That ought to take you back to the dear old Soda Springs, eh? Tee-hee? Yes, I've cut liquor right out these days. The other resumed his watering, sternly moving on down the fence, and the consul, not sorry to leave the fruit tree, to which he had noticed clinging the sinister carapace of the 7-year-old locust, followed him step by step. Yes, I'm on the wagon now, he commented, in case you didn't know. The funeral wagon, I'd say, Fearman, Quincy muttered testily. By the way, I saw one of those little garter snakes just a moment ago, the consul broke out. Mr. Quincy coughed or snorted, but said nothing. It made me think, do you know, Quincy, I've often wondered whether there isn't more in the old legend of Garden of Eden, and so on, that meets the eye. What if Adam wasn't really banished from the place after all? That is, in the sense we used to understand it. The walnut grower had looked up and was fixing him with a steady gaze that seemed, however, directed at a point rather below the consul's midriff. What if his punishment really consisted, the consul continued with his warmth, in his having to go on living there, alone of course, suffering unseen, cut out from God. Or perhaps, he added in a more cheerful vein, perhaps Adam was the first property owner and God the first agrarian, the kind of garden us. In fact, tee, kicked him out, eh? Yes. The consul chuckled, aware, moreover, that all this was possibly not so amusing under the existing circumstances. For it's obvious to everyone these days, don't you think so, Quincy, that the original sin was to be an owner of property? The walnut grower was nodding at him, almost imperceptibly, but was not in any agreement. His realpolitik eye was still concentrated upon that same spot below his midriff, and looking down the consul discovered his open fly. Placentia vatum indeed. Pardon me, ja dube, he said, and making the adjustment, continued, laughing, returning to his first theme mysteriously unabashed by his recusancy. Yes, indeed, yes. And of course the real reason for the punishment, his being forced to go on living in a garden, might as well have been simply the poor fellow who knows, secretly loathed the place. Simply hated it, and had done so all along. And that the old man found this out. Was it my imagination, or did I see your wife up there a while ago? Patiently said Mr. Quincy. And no wonder, to hell with this place. Just think of all the scorpions and leaf-cutter ants, to mention only a few of the abominations he must have had to put up with. What? The consul exclaimed as the other repeated his question. In the garden? Yes, that is no. How do you know? No, she's asleep as far as I've been awake quite a time, hasn't she? The other asked mildly, leaning forward so that he could still see more clearly the consul's bungalow. Your brother still there? Brother? Oh, you mean Hugh? No, he's in Mexico City. I think you'll find he's gone back. The consul now glanced up at the house himself. Hicket, he said briefly, apprehensively. I think he went out with your wife, the walnut grower added. Hello, hello, look who comes by. Hello, little snake in my little anguish and error. The consul at this moment greeted Mr. Quincy's cat, momentarily forgetting its owner against the gray, meditative animal, with a tail so long it trailed on the ground. Came stalking through the zinnias. He stooped, patting his thighs. Hello, pussy, and my little Priapus, my little Oedipus. And the cat, recognizing a friend and uttering a cry of pleasure, wound through the fence and rubbed against the consul's legs, purring. My little Seco Tenkatl. The consul stood up. He gave 2 short whistles by below him. The cat's ears twirled. She thinks I'm a tree with a bird in it, he added. I wouldn't wonder, retorted Mr. Quincy, who was refilling his watering can at the hydrant. Animals not fit for food and kept only for pleasure, curiosity, or a whim, eh? As William Blackstone said. You've only heard of him, of course. The consul was somehow on his haunches, half talking to the cat, half to the walnut grower, who had paused to light a cigarette. Or was that another William Blackstone? He addressed himself now directly to Mr. Quincy, who was paying no attention. He's a character I've always liked. I think it was William Blackstone, or so Abraham. Anyway, one day he arrived in what is now, I believe, no matter, somewhere in Massachusetts, and lived there quietly among the Indians. After a while, the Puritans settled on the other side of the river. They invited him over. They said it was healthier on this side, you see. Ah, these people, these fellows with their ideas, he told the cat. Old William didn't like them. No, he didn't. So he went back to live with the Indians. And so he did. But the Puritans found him out once he trusted them. Then he disappeared altogether. God knows where. Now, little cat, the consul tapped his chest indicatively. And the cat, its face swelled, body arched, important, stepped back. The Indians aren't here. They sure are, sighed Mr. Quincy, somewhat in the manner of a quietly exacerbated sergeant major. Along with all those snakes and pink elephants and them tigers you were talking about. The consul laughed, his laughter having a humorless sound, as though the part of his mind that knew all this essentially a burlesque of a great and generous man, once his friend knew how hollow the satisfaction afforded him by the performance. Now real Indians, and I didn't mean in the garden, but in here, he tapped his chest again. Yeah, just the final frontier of consciousness, that's all. Genius, as I'm so fond of saying, he added, standing up, adjusting his tie. And he did not think further of the tie, squaring his shoulders as if to go with the decisiveness that, also borrowed on this occasion from the same source of the genius, and his interest in cats left him abruptly as it had been assumed. Genius will look after himself. Somewhere in the distance a clock was striking. The consul stood still, motionless. Oh, Yvonne, can I have forgotten you already? On this of all days? 19, 20, 21 strokes. By his watch it was 11:15, but the clock hadn't finished. Struck twice more, 2 wry, tragic notes. Bing bong, whirring. The emptiness in the air after filled with whimpers. Alas, alas. Wings, it really meant. Where's your friend these days? I can never remember the name. The French fellow, Mr. Quincy asked a moment ago. Laurel? The consul's voice came from far away. He was aware of vertigo. Closing his eyes wearily, he took hold of the fence to steady himself. Mr. Quincy's words knocked on his consciousness, or someone actually was knocking on the door. Fell away, then knocked again, louder. Old De Quincy. The knocking on the gate in Macbeth. Knock, knock. Who's there? Cat. Cat who? Catastrophe. Catastrophe who? Woof. Castrophysicist. What is it, you, my little public cat? Just waiting an eternity till Jacques and I have finished murdering sleep. Catabasis to catabasis. Catharsis to tarsis. Of course he should have known it. These were the final moments of the retiring of the human heart and the final entrance of that fiendish, the night insulated. Just as the real De Quincy, that mere drug fraud, he thought, opening his eyes, he found he was looking straight over toward the tequila bottle. Imagine the murder of Duncan and the others insulated, self-withdrawn into a deep syncope and suspension of earthly passion. But where had Quincy gone? And my God, who is this advancing behind the morning paper to his rescue across the lawn, where the breath of the hoses had suddenly failed as if by magic? Not Dr. Guzman. Dr. Guzman, if not, it could not be, but it was. It certainly was no less a figure than that of his companion the night before, Dr. Vigil. And what on earth would he be doing here? As the figure approached closer, the consul felt an increasing uneasiness. Quincy was his patient, doubtless. But that wasn't the case. In that case, why isn't the doctor in the house? Why all the secret prowling among the garden? It could only mean one thing. Vigil's visit had somehow been timed to coincide with his own probable visit to the tequila, though he had fooled them neatly there, with the object, naturally, of spying on him, of obtaining some information about him, some clue to the nature of which might all too conceivably be found within the pages of that accusing newspaper. Old Samaritan case to be reopened. Commander Fearman believed in Mexico. Fearman found guilty. Acquitted, cries in box. Fearman innocent, but bears guilt of world on shoulders. Body of Fearman found drunk in bunker. Such monstrous headlines as these indeed took shape in the consul's mind, for it was not merely El Universal the doctor was reading, it was his fate. But the creatures of his more immediate conscience were not to be denied. They seemed silently to accompany that morning paper too, withdrawing on one side as the doctor came to a standstill, looking at him with averted heads, listening, murmuring now, "You cannot lie to us. We know what you did last night." What had he done, though? He saw again very clearly as Dr. Vigil, recognizing him with a smile, closed his paper and hastened toward him. The doctor's consulting room in the Avenida de la Revolucion, visited for some drunken reason in the early hours of the morning, macabre with his pictures of ancient Spanish surgeons, their goat faces rising queerly from ruffs resembling ectoplasm, roaring with laughter as they performed inquisitorial operations. But since all this was retained as a mere vivid setting completely detached from its own activity, and since it was about all he did remember, he could scarcely take comfort from not seeming to appear within it in any vicious role. Not so much comfort, at least, as had been afforded him by Vigil's smile, nor half so much as was now afforded him when the doctor, upon reaching the spot lately vacated by the walnut grower, halted and suddenly bowed to him profoundly from the waist. Bowed over, twice, thrice, mutely yet tremendously. Mutely yet tremendously, assuring the consul that after all no crime had been committed during the night, so great he was still not worthy of respect. Then simultaneously the two men groaned. "Que te," began the consul. "Por favor," broke in the other hoarsely, placing a well-manicured, though shaky finger to his lips, and with a slightly worried look upon the garden. The consul nodded. "Of course. You're looking so fit. I see you haven't had the ball all night," he added loudly and loyally, following the other's gaze, though Mr. Quincy, who after all could not have been so fit, was still nowhere to be seen. He was probably turning off the hoses at the main hydrant, and how absurd to have suspected a plan when it was so patently an informal call, and the doctor had just happened to notice Quincy working in the garden from the drive. He lowered his voice. "At the same time, might I take this opportunity of asking you what you prescribe for a slight case of Katzenjammer?" The doctor gave another worried look down the garden and began to laugh quietly, though his whole body was shaking with mirth. His white teeth flashed in the sun. Even his immaculate blue suit seemed to be laughing. "Senor," he began, biting off his laughter short on his lip, like a child with his front teeth. "Senor Firman, por favor. I am sorry, but I must comport myself here like..." He looked round him again, catching his breath. "Like an apostle." "You mean, senor," he went on more evenly, "that you are feeling fine this morning, quite like the cat's pajamas." "Well, hardly," said the consul, softly as before, casting a suspicious eye for his part in the other direction at some maguey growing beyond the barranca, like a battalion moving up a slope under machine gun fire. See me. Dr. Vigil started. A half-playful smile hovered at the corner of his lips as he contrived rather unsteadily to roll up his paper into a neat cylindrical tube. "You mean not cats?" And he made a swift rippling, circular crawling gesture in front of his eyes with one hand. But rather, the consul nodded cheerfully, for his mind was at rest. He had caught a glimpse of those morning headlines, which seemed entirely concerned with the Pope's illness and the Battle of Ebro. "Progression," the doctor was repeating the gesture more slowly with his eyes closed, his fingers crawling separately, curved like claws, his head shaking idiotically. "A ratos," he pounced. "See," he said, pursing his lips and clapping his hands to his forehead in a motion of mock horror. "See," he repeated. "Terribly. More alcohol is perhaps best." He smiled. "Your doctor tells me that in my case delirium tremens may not prove fatal," the consul, triumphantly himself at last, informed Mr. Quincy, who came up just at this moment. And at the next moment, though not before there had passed between him and the doctor a barely perceptible exchange of signals, a tiny symbolic mouthward flick of the wrist on the consul's side as he glanced up at the bungalow, and upon Vigil's slight flapping moment of the arms extended, apparently at the actor's stretching, which meant, in the obscure language known only to major adepts in the great brotherhood of alcohol, "Come up and have a spot when you're finished. I shouldn't for it. If I do, I shall be flying. But on second thought, perhaps I will." It seemed he was back drinking from his bottle of tequila, and the moment after that he was drinking slowly and powerfully through the sunlit back towards the bungalow itself, accompanied by Mr. Quincy's cat, who was following an insect of some sort along his path. The consul floated in amber glow. Beyond the house, where now the problems awaited him seemed already on the point of energetic solution, the day before him stretched out like an illimitable, rolling, wonderful desert in which one was going, though in a delightful way, to be lost, lost, but not so completely that he would be unable to find the few necessary waterholes, or the scattered tequila oases where witty legionnaires of damnation who couldn't understand a word he said would wave him on, replenished, in that glorious Parian wilderness where man never went thirsty, and where he now was drawn on beautifully by the dissolving mirages past the skeletons like frozen wire, and the wandering, dreaming lions towards the ineluctable personal disaster. Always in a delightful way, of course. The disaster might ever be found at the end to contain a certain element of triumph. Not that the consul now felt gloomy. Quite the contrary. The outlook had rarely seemed so bright. He became conscious for the first time of the extraordinary activity which everywhere surrounded him in his garden. A lizard going up a tree, another kind of lizard coming down a tree, a bottle green hummingbird exploring a flower, another kind of hummingbird voraciously at another flower, huge butterflies whose precise stitch markings reminded one of the blasses in the market, flopping about with indolent gymnastic grace, much as Yvonne had described them greeting her in Acapulco Bay yesterday. A storm of torn-up, multicolored love letters tossing to windward past the saloons on the promenade deck. Ants with petals or scarlet blossoms tackling hither and thither along the paths, while from below, from the sky, and it might be from under the earth, came a continual sound of whistling, gnawing, rattling, even trumpeting. Where was his friend the snake now? Hiding up a pear tree, probably. A snake that waited to drop rings on you. Horseshoes. From the branches of these pear trees hung carafes full of a gluttonous yellow substance for trapping insects, still changed religiously every month by the local horticultural college. How gay were the Mexicans! The horticulturists made the occasion, as they made every possible occasion, a sort of dance, bringing their womenfolk with them, flitting from tree to tree, gathering up and replacing the carafes as though the whole thing were a movement in a comic ballet, afterwards lolling about in the shade for hours, as if the consul himself did not exist. Then the behavior of Mr. Quincy's cat began to fascinate him. The creature had at last caught the insect, but instead of devouring it, she was holding its body, still uninjured, delicately between her teeth, while its lovely luminous wings, still beating, for the insect had not stopped flying an instant, protruded from either side of her whiskers, fanning them. The consul stooped forward to her rescue, but the animal bounded just out of reach. He stooped again, with the same result. In this preposterous fashion, the consul stooping, the cat dancing just out of reach, the insect still flying furiously in the cat's mouth, he approached his porch. Finally, the cat extended a preparate paw for the kill, opening her mouth, and the insect, whose wings had never ceased to beat, suddenly and marvelously flew out, as might indeed the human soul from the jaws of death. They were standing on the porch. Yvonne's arms were full of bougainvillea, and she was arranging in a cobalt ceramic vase. But suppose he's absolutely adamant. Suppose he simply won't go. Hugh, careful, it's got spikes on it, and you have to look everything carefully to be sure there's no spiders. Hi there, Suchiquetal, the consul shouted gaily, waving his hand as the cat with such a frigid look over her shoulder that said plainly, I didn't want it anyway. I meant to let it go. Galloped away, humiliated into the bushes. Hi there, Hugh, you old snake in the grass. Why then should he be sitting in the bathroom? Was he asleep, dead, passed out? Was he in the bathroom now or half an hour ago? Was it night? Where were the others? But now he heard some of the others' voices on the porch. Some of the others? It was just Hugh and Yvonne, of course, for the doctor had gone. Yet for a moment he could have sworn the house had been full of people. Why, it was still this morning, or barely afternoon, only 12:15 in fact by his watch. At 11 he'd been talking to Mr. Quincy. Oh, the consul groaned aloud. It came to him he was supposed to be getting ready to go to Tourmaline. But how had he managed to persuade anyone who was sober enough to go to Tourmaline? And why, anyhow, Tourmaline? A procession of thoughts like little elderly animals filed through the consul's mind. And his mind was too, he was steadily crossing the porch again, as he had done an hour ago, immediately after he'd seen the insect flying out of the cat's mouth. He crossed the porch, which Concepta had swept, smiling soberly to Yvonne and shaking hands with Hugh on his way to the icebox, and unfastening it. He knew not only they'd been talking about him, but obscurely, from that bright fragment of overheard conversation, its round meaning, just had he at that moment glimpsed the new moon with the old one in its arms. He might have been impressed by its complete shape, though the rest were shadowy, illuminated only by earthlight. What had happened then? Oh, the consul cried again. The faces of the last hour hovered before him, the figures of Hugh and Yvonne and Dr. Vigil, moving quickly and jerkily, now like those of an old silent film. Their words, mute explosions in the brain. Nobody seemed to be doing anything important, yet things seemed to be of the utmost hectic importance. For instance, Yvonne saying, "We saw an armadillo." "What? No, Tarsius spectrus." He had replied, then he opening the freezer bottle of Carta Blanca beer before him, prizing off the fizzing cap on the edge of the parapet and decanting the foam into his glass, the contiguity of which the strychnine bottle had, must be admitted now, lost most of its significance. In the bathroom, the consul became aware he still had with him a half glass of slightly flat beer. His hand was fairly steady, but numbed holding the glass. He drank cautiously, carefully postponing the problem soon to be raised by his emptiness. "Nonsense," he said to Hugh, and he had added with impressive consulary authority that Hugh couldn't leave immediately anyway, at least not for Mexico City, for there was only one bus today, the one that Hugh'd come on, which had gone back to the city already, and the one train didn't leave until 11:45 p.m. Then, but it wasn't the Bougainville doctor, Yvonne was asking, and it was really astonishing how sinister and urgent and inflamed all the minutiae seemed to him in the bathroom. Wasn't the Bougainville who discovered the Bougainville? While the doctor, bending over the flowers, merely looked alert and puzzled, he said nothing save with his eyes, which perhaps barely betrayed that he'd stumbled on a situation. "Now I come to think of it, I believe it was Bougainville, hence the name," he observed fatuously, seating himself on the parapet. "See, you can go to the Bodica, and so not to be misunderstood, se favor de servir una toma de vino quinado o de su defecto una toma nuez vomico, por favor." Pero, Dr. Vigil was chocolate. Talking to Hugh must have been. Yvonne, having slipped into a room moment while the consul, eavesdropping, was at the icebox for another bottle of beer. Then, "Oh, I was so terribly sick this morning, I needed to be holding myself to the street windows." And to the consul himself as he returned, "Please forgive my stupid comport last night. Oh, I have done a lot of stupid things everywhere these last few days, but," raising his glass of whiskey, "I'll never drink anymore. I will need 2 full days of sleeping to recover myself." And then, as Yvonne returned, magnificently giving the whole show away, raised his glass to the consul again. "Salute. I hope you are not as sick as I am. You were so perfectamente borracho last night. I think you must have killed yourself with drinking. I think even to send a boy after you this morning to knock on your door and find if drinking had not killed you already," Dr. Vigil said. A strange fellow. In the bathroom, the consul sipped his fat beer. A strange, decent, generous-hearted fellow. If slightly deficient in tact, save on his own behalf. Why couldn't people hold their liquor? He himself can still manage to be quite considerate of Vigil's position in Quincy's garden. In the final analysis, there was no one you could trust to drink with you to the bottom of the bowl, a lonely thought. But of the doctor's generosity there was little doubt. Before long indeed, in spite of the necessary 2 full days of sleeping, he had been inviting them all to come with him to Guanajuato. Recklessly, he proposed leaving for his holiday by car this evening. After a problematic set of tennis this afternoon the consul took another sip of beer. Oh, he shuddered. It had been a mild shock last night to discover that Vigil and Jacques Laurel were friends. Far more than embarrassing to be reminded of this morning. Anyhow, Hugh had turned down the notion of the 200-mile trip to Guanajuato, since Hugh, and how amazingly well after all those cowboy clothes seemed to suit his erect and careless being, was now determined to catch that night train, while the consul declined on Yvonne's account. The consul saw himself again, hovering over the parapet, gazing down at the swimming pool below, a little turquoise set in the garden. "Thou art the grave where buried love doth lie." The inverted reflections of banana trees and birds, caravans of clouds, moved in it. Wisps of new-mown turf floated on the surface. Fresh mountain water trickled into the pool, which was almost overflowing, from the cracked, broken hose whose length was a series of small, spouting fountains. Then Yvonne and Hugh, below, were swimming in the pool. "Absolutamente," the doctor had said, beside the consul at the parapet, and attentively lighting a cigarette. "I have," the consul was telling him, lifting his face toward the volcanoes and feeling his desolation go out these new heights, where even now at the mid-morning the howling snow would whip his face, and the ground beneath the feet was dead lava, a soulless, petrified residue of extinct plasm, in which even the wildest and loneliest trees would never take root. "I have another enemy round the back you can't see, a sunflower. I know it watches me, and I know it hates me." "Exactamente," Dr. Vigil said. "Very possibly it might be hating you a little less if you had stopped from drinking tequila." Yes, but I'm only drinking beer this morning, the counsel said with conviction, as you can see for yourself. Si, hombre, Dr. Vigil nodded, who, after a few whiskeys from a new bottle, had given up trying to conceal himself from Mr. Quincy's house and was standing boldly by the parapet with the consul. There are, the consul added, 1,000 aspects of this infernal beauty I was talking about, each with its particular tortures, each jealous as a woman of all stimulations save its own. Naturalmente, Dr. Vigil said, but I think if you are very serious about your progression ratos, you may take a longer journey even than this proposed one. The consul placed his glass in the parapet while the doctor continued. Me too, unless we contain it within ourselves, never to drink no more. I think, mi amigo, sickness is not only the body, but in that part used to be called soul. Soul? Precisamente, the doctor said, swiftly clasping and unclasping his fingers. But a mesh? Mesh. The nerves are a mesh, like how you say, an eclectic system. Ah, very good, the consul said. You mean an electric system. But after much tequila, the eclectic system is perhaps un poco descompuesto. Comprendes? As sometimes in the cine, claro? A sort of enclampsia, as it were. The consul nodded despairingly, removing his glasses, and at this point the consul remembered he had been without a drink nearly 10 minutes. The effect of the tequila, too, had almost gone. He had peered out at the garden, and it was as though bits of his eyelids had broken off and were flittering and jittering about before him, turning into nervous shapes and shadows, jumping to the guilty chattering in his mind. Not quite voices yet, but they were coming back. They were coming back. A picture of his soul as a town appeared once more before him, but this time a town ravaged and stricken in the black path of his excesses, and shutting his burning eyes, he had thought of the beautiful functioning of the system and those who were truly alive. Switches connected, nerves rigid only in real danger, and the nightmarish sleep calm now. Yet poised, a peaceful village. Christ, how it heightened the torture. In the meantime, there had been every reason to suppose the others imagined he was enjoying himself enormously, to be aware of all this, while at the same time conscious of the whole horrible disintegrating mechanism. The light now off, now on too glaringly, now on too dimly, with the glow of a fitful dying battery. Then at last to know the whole town plunged into darkness, where communication is lost. Motion mere obstruction, bombs threaten, idea stampede. The consul had now finished his glass of flat beer. He sat gazing at the bathroom wall in an attitude like a grotesque parody of an old attitude in mediation. I'm very much interested in insanes. That was a strange way to start a conversation with a fellow who just stood you a drink. Yet that was precisely how the doctor and the Bella Vista bar had started their conversation the previous night. Could it be Vigil considered his practiced eye detected approaching insanity? As some who have watched wind and weather all their lives can prophesy under a fair sky, the approaching storm, the darkness that will come galloping out of nowhere, across the fields of the mind. Not that there could be said to be a very fair sky either in that connection. Yet how interested would the doctor have been in one who felt himself being shattered by the very forces of the universe? What cataplasms have laid on his soul? What even did the hierophants of science know of the fearful potencies of, for them, unvintageable evil? The consul wouldn't have needed a practiced eye to detect this on a wall, or any other, a mene tekel peres for the world, compared to which mere insanity was the drop in a bucket. Yet who would ever have believed that some obscure man, sitting at the center of the world in the bathroom, say, thinking solitary, miserable thoughts, was authoring their doom, that, even while he was thinking, it was as if behind the scenes certain strings were pulled, and whole continents burst into flame, and calamity moved nearer, just as now, at this moment perhaps, with a sudden jolt and grind, calamity had moved nearer, and, without the consul's knowing it, outside the sky, or perhaps it was not a man at all, but a child, a little child, innocent as that other Joffrey had been, who sat up in an organ loft somewhere pulling out all the stops at random, and kingdoms divided and fell, and abominations dropped from the sky. A child innocent as that infant child sleeping in the coffin which had slanted past them down the Calle Tierra de Fuego. The consul lifted his glass to his lips, tasted its emptiness again, then set it on the floor, still wet from the feet of the swimmers. The uncontrollable mystery on the bathroom floor. He remembered that the next time he had returned to the porch with a bottle of Carta Blanca, though for some reason this now seemed a terribly long time ago, in the past, it was as if something he could not put his finger on had mysteriously supervened to separate drastically the returning figure from himself, sitting in the bathroom. The figure on the porch, for all its damnation, seemed younger, to have more freedom of movement, choice, to have only because it held a full glass of beer once more, a better chance of a future. Yvonne, youthful and pretty-looking in her white satin bathing suit, had been wandering on tiptoe round the doctor, who was saying, "Signora Firmin, I am really disappointed though you cannot come with me." The consul and she had exchanged a look of understanding. It almost amounted to, then Yvonne was swimming again below, and the doctor was saying to the consul, "Guanajuato is seated in a beautiful circus of steepy hills." "Guanajuato," the doctor was saying. "You will not believe me, how she can lie there, like the old golden jewel on the breast of her grandmother." "Guanajuato," Dr. Vigil said, "the streets. How can you resist the names of the street? The street of kisses, street of singing frogs, street of little head. Is that not revolting?" "Repellent," the consul said. "Isn't Guanajuato the place where they bury everyone standing up?" Ah, and this was where he had remembered about the bull throwing and the feeling of a return of energy, and had called down to Hugh, who was sitting thoughtfully by the edge of the pool, in the consul's swimming trunks. "Tomoline's quite near Padillon, where your pal is going," he said. "We might even go on there." And then to the doctor, "Perhaps you might come too. I left my favorite pipe in Padillon, which I might get back, with luck, in the Farolito." And the doctor had said, "Oui, es un inferno." While Yvonne, lifting up a corner of her bathing cap to hear better, said meekly, "Not a bullfight," and the consul, "No, a bull throwing, if you're not too tired." But the doctor could not, of course, come to Tomoline with them, though this was never discussed, since just then the conversation was violently interrupted by a sudden terrific detonation that shook the house, set birds skimmering, panic-stricken all over the garden. Target practice in Sierra Madre. The consul had been half aware of it in his sleep earlier. Puffs of smoke were drifting high over the rocks below Popo at the end of the valley. 3 black vultures came tearing through the trees low over the roofs with soft hoarse cries like the cries of love. Driven at unaccustomed speed by their fear, they seemed almost to capsize, keeping close together but balancing at different angles to avoid collision. They then sought another tree to wait in, and echoes of gunfire swept back over the house, soaring higher and higher and growing fainter, while somewhere a clock was striking 19. 12 o'clock, the consul said to the doctor. "Ah, that, the dream of dark magician in his vision cave, even while his hand, that's the bit I like, shakes its last decay. We're the true end of this lovely world. Jesus, do you know, compañero, I sometimes have the feeling that it's actually sinking, like Atlantis, beneath my feet. Down to the frightful pulps, Meropis or of Theopompus, and the Invignome mountains." And the doctor, who was nodding gloomily, said, "Si, that is tequila, hombre. Un poco de cerveza, un poco de vino, but never no more tequila. Never no more mezcal." And the doctor was whispering, "But, hombre, now that your esposo has come back," it seemed that Dr. Vigil had said this several times, only with a different look on his face. "But, hombre, now that your esposo has come back." And then he was going, "I did not need to be inquisitive to be knowing what you might wish in my advice. No, hombre, I say last night, I am not so interested in monies. Con permiso, the plaster he can do no good." A little shower of plaster had indeed rained down on the doctor's head. Then, "Hasta la vista. Adios. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much." And now the consul was in the bathroom getting ready to go to Tomoline. "Oh," he said. "Oh, but you see, nothing so dire had happened, after all." First to wash. Sweating and trembling again, he took off his coat and shirt. He had turned on the water in the basin, yet for some obscure reason he was standing under the shower, waiting in an agony for the shock of cold water that never came. And he was still wearing his trousers. The consul sat helplessly in the bathroom, watching the insects which lay at different angles from one another on the wall, like ships out in the roadstead. The caterpillar started to wriggle towards him, peering this way and that, with interrogatory antennae. A large cricket, with polished fuselage, clung to the curtain, swaying it slightly and cleaning its face like a cat, its eyes on stalks appearing to revolve in its head. Now a scorpion was moving slowly across towards him. Suddenly the consul rose, trembling in every limb, but it wasn't the scorpion he cared about. It was that all at once the thin shadows of isolated nails, the stains of murdered mosquitoes, the very scars and cracks of the wall, had begun to swarm, so that wherever he looked another insect was born, wriggling instantly toward his heart. It was if, and this was most appalling, the whole insect world had somehow moved nearer and now was closing, rushing upon him. For a moment the bottle of tequila at the bottom of the garden gleamed on his soul. Then the consul stumbled into his bedroom. Here there was no longer the terrible visible swarming yet. Lying now on the bed, it still seemed to persist in his mind, much as the vision of the dead man earlier had persisted, a kind of seething from which, as from the persistent rolling of drums, heard by some great dying monarch, occasionally a half-recognizable voice dissociated itself. "Stop it, for God's sake, you fool. Watch your step. We can't help you anymore. I'd like the privilege of helping you, out of our friendship. I would work with you. I do not care a damn for monies anyway. What, is this you, Joffrey? Don't you remember me? Your old friend Abe. What have you done, boy?" Ha, you're for it now, straightened out in a coffin. Yeah. My son, my lover, oh come to me again as once in May. Chapter 6. Nel mezzo del bloody cammin di nostra vita near Xavier, he flung himself down on the porch table. A strong, warm, gusty wind howled over the garden. Refreshed by his swim and a lunch of turkey sandwiches, the cigar Jeff had given him earlier partially shielded by the parapet, he lay watching the clouds speeding across the Mexican skies. How fast they went, how far too fast. In the middle of our life, in the middle of our bloody road of our life. 29 clouds. At 29 a man was in his 30th year, and he was 29. And now at last, the feeling he had perhaps been growing on him all morning, he knew what it felt like. The intolerable impact that this might have come at 22, but had not. That it had at least to have come at 25, but still somehow had not. This knowledge, hitherto associated only with people tottering on the brink of the grave, a naive houseman, that one could not be young forever, that in the twinkling of an eye, one was not young any longer. For in less than 4 years, passing so swiftly today's cigarettes seemed smoked yesterday, one would be 33, in 7 more, 40, in 47, 80. 67 years seemed a comfortingly long time, but then he would be 100. I'm not a prodigy any longer. I have no excuse any longer to behave in this irresponsible fashion. I am not such a dashing fellow after all. I am not young. On the other hand, I am a prodigy. I am young. I am a dashing fellow. Am I not? You are a liar, said the trees tossing in the garden. You are a traitor, rattled the plantain leaves, and a coward too, put in some fitful sounds of music that might have meant that the Zolico, the fair was beginning. And they are losing the battle of the Ebro, because you, said the wind. A traitor even to your journalist friends who you like to run down, and who really are courageous men. Admit it. Ah, Hugh, as if to rid himself of these thoughts, turned the radio dial back and forth, trying to get San Antonio. I am none of these things, really. I have done nothing to warrant all this guilt. I am no worse than anyone else. But it was no good. All his resolutions of this morning were to no avail. It seemed useless to struggle any further with these thoughts, better to let them have their way. At least they would take his mind from Yvonne for a time, if they only led back to her in the end. Even Juan Cedillo failed him now, as did, at this moment, San Antonio. 2 Mexican voices on different wavelengths were breaking in. For everything you have done up to now has been dishonest, the first might have been saying. What about the way you treated poor old Belowski, the music publisher? Remember his shabby little shop in Old Compton Street off Tottenham Court Road? Even what you persuade yourself is the best thing about you, your passion for helping the Jews, has some basis in a dishonorable action of your own. Small wonder, since he so charitably forgave you, that you forgave him his skullduggery, to the point of being prepared to lead the whole Jewish race out of Babylon itself. No, I am much afraid there is little enough in your past which will come to your aid against the future. Not even the seagull, said Hugh. The seagull, pure scavenger of the Empyrean, hunter of edible stars. I rescued that day as a boy when it was caught in a fence on the cliffside and beating itself to death, blinded by snow, and though it attacked me, I drew it out unharmed, with one hand by its feet, and for one magnificent moment held up in the sunlight, before it soared away on angelic wings over the freezing estuary. The artillery started blasting away in the foothills again. A train hooted somewhere, like an approaching steamer, perhaps the very train that he'd be taking tonight. From the bottom of the swimming pool below reflected a small sun blazed and nodding among the inverted papayas. Reflections of vultures a mile deep wheeled upside down and were gone. A bird, quite close really, seemed to be moving in a series of jerks across the glittering summit of Popo. The wind, in fact, had dropped. Good timing. Which was as well for his cigar. The radio had gone dead, too, and Hugh gave it up, settling himself back on the daybed. Not even the seagull was the answer, of course. The seagull had been spoiled already by his dramatizing it. Nor yet the poor little hot dog man. That bitter December night he had met him trudging down Oxford Street with his new wagon, the first hot dog wagon in London, and he had been pushing it around for a whole month without selling a single hot dog. Now, with the family to support and Christmas approaching, he was on his uppers. Shades of Charles Dickens. It was perhaps the newness of the wretched wagon he had been cozened into buying that seemed so awful. But how could he expect, Hugh asked him, as above them the monstrous deception twitched on and off, and all around them the black, soulless buildings stood wrapped in the cold dream of their own destruction. They had halted by a church from whose city wall a figure of Christ on the cross had been removed, leaving only the scar and the legend. It is nothing to you all ye who pass by? How could he expect to see anything so revolutionary as a hot dog in Oxford Street? He might as well try ice cream at the South Pole. No, the idea was to camp outside a pub down a back alley, and that not any pub, but the Fitzroy Tavern in Charlotte Street, chock full of starving artists drinking themselves to death simply because their souls pined away, each night between 8 and 10, for lack of such a thing as a hot dog. That was the place to go. And not even the hot dog man was the answer, even though by Christmas time, obviously, he had been doing a roaring trade outside the Fitzroy. He suddenly sat up, scattering cigar ash everywhere. And yet it is nothing I am beginning to atone for my past, so largely negative, selfish, absurd, and dishonest, that I propose to sit atop of a shipload of dynamite bound for the hard-pressed loyalist armies. Nothing that after all I am willing to give my life for humanity, if not in minute particulars. Nothing to ye that pass by, though what on earth he expected it to be, if none of his friends knew what he was going to do it was not very clear. So far as the consul was concerned, he probably suspected him of doing something even more reckless, and it had to be admitted one was not altogether averse to this. It had not prevented the consul from still hinting uncomfortably close to the truth, that the whole stupid beauty of such a decision, made by anyone at a time like this, must lie in that it was so futile, that it was too late, that the loyalists had already lost, and that should that person emerge safe and sound, no one would be able to say of him that he had been carried away by the popular wave of enthusiasm for Spain, when even the Russians had given up, and the internationalists withdrawn. But death and truth could rhyme in a pinch. There was the old dodge, too, of telling anyone who shook the dust of the city of destruction from his feet he was running away from himself and his responsibilities. But the useful thought struck Hugh. I have no responsibilities, and how can I be escaping for myself when I am without a place on earth? No home. Piece of driftwood on the Indian Ocean. Is India my home? Disguise myself as an untouchable, which should not be so difficult, and go to prison on the Andaman Island for 77 years, until England gives India her freedom. But I will tell you this, you would only by doing so be embarrassing Mahatma Gandhi, secretly the only public figure in the world for whom you have any respect. No, I respect Stalin too, Cardenas, and Jawaharlal Nehru. All three of whom would probably only be embarrassed by my respect. Hugh had another shot at San Antonio. The radio came alive with a vengeance. At the Texan station, news of a flood was being delivered with such rapidity, one gained the impression the commentator himself was in danger of drowning. Another narrator in a higher voice gobbled bankruptcy, disaster, while yet another told of a misery blanketing threatened capital, people stumbling through debris littering darkened streets, hurrying thousands seeking shelter in bomb-torn darkness. How well he knew the jargon. Darkness, disaster. How the world fed on it. In the wars to come, correspondence would assume unheard-of importance, plunging through flame to feed the public its little goblets of dehydrated excrement. A bawling scream abruptly warned of the stocks lower, or irregularly higher, the price of grain, cotton, metal, munitions. While static rattled on eternally below, poltergeists of the ether, clackerers of the idiotic, Hugh inclined his ear to the pulse of the world beating that latticed throat, whose voice is now pretending to be horrified at the very thing by which it proposed to be engulfed. The first moment it could be perfectly certain the engulfing process had long at last been heard. Oh, what? He switched the radio off and lay, a cigar between his fingers, staring at the port ceiling. Joe Venturi had not been the same, one heard, since Ed Lang died. The latter suggested guitars, and if Hugh ever wrote, as he often threatened to do, his autobiography, though it would have been rather unnecessary, his life being one of those that perhaps lent itself to such a brief summary in magazines as So-and-so is 29, has been riveter, songwriter, watcher of manholes, stoker, sailor, riding instructor, variety artist, bandsman, bacon stripper, saint, clown, soldier for 5 minutes, and usher in a spiritualist church, from which it should not always be assumed that far from having acquired through his experiences a wider view of existence, he has a somewhat narrower notion than any bank clerk who has never set foot outside Newcastle under Lyme. But if he ever wrote it, he reflected, he would have to admit that a guitar made a pretty symbol in his life. He had not played one, and Hugh could play almost any kind of guitar for 4 or 5 years, and its numerous instruments declined within his books in basements or attics in London or Paris, in Wardour Street nightclubs, or behind the bar of Marquis of Granby, or the old Astoria on Greek Street, long since become a convent, and his bill still unpaid there. in pawn shops in Tisbarn Street or Tottenham Court Road, where he imagined them as waiting for a time when all their sounds and echoes for the heavy step, and then, little by little, as they gathered dust, and each successive string broke, giving up hope, each string a causer to the fading memory of their friend, snapping off, the highest pitched strings always first, snapping with sharp, gun-like... I think I gotta go this way. Snapping with sharp, gun-like reports, or curious, agonized whines, or provocative nocturnal meows, like a nightmare in the sound of George Frederick Watts, till there was nothing but blank, untumultuous face of the songless lyre itself, a soundless cape for spiders and steam flies, and the delicate fretted neck, just as each began breaking string had severed Hugh himself, pang by pang, from his youth, while the past remained.